The first light of dawn broke across the eastern horizon. It was June 22nd, 1941. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the silence of the night was shattered by thunder. Over 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in human history, crossed into the Soviet Union. Columns of panzers roared forward, their engines shaking the ground. Luftwaffe bombers screamed overhead, targeting airfields and rail lines. The roads turned black with men, trucks, and horses, a river of steel flowing eastward. Operation Barbarossa had begun. To the German High Command it seemed like destiny fulfilled. Hitler stood in his mountain headquarters, confident that he was about to crush his greatest ideological enemy, Bolshevism. After the lightning victories in France and the Low Countries, after the humiliation of Britain's retreat at Dunkirk, he believed Germany was invincible. The Reich's power stretched from the Atlantic to the Balkans. Europe itself seemed conquered. Yet even as Hitler watched his armies surge forward, one of his generals muttered a warning under his breath. "This is the beginning of the end." They had all seen Hitler's growing impatience, his obsession with grand visions and quick victories. He spoke of history, of destiny, of willpower being stronger than any army. But war was not won by belief alone. As the German columns moved deeper into Soviet territory, the skies turned grey with smoke and dust. Roads disintegrated, supply lines stretched, and maps grew useless. Still, Hitler demanded speed advance at all costs. What he didn't realize was that this single decision, the invasion of the Soviet Union, would become the turning point of the entire war. It was the day the conqueror overreached, the day his empire began to collapse, though no one yet knew it, because beneath the triumph of those early hours lay arrogance, a blindness to history itself, and from that blindness would come disaster. The question now was not whether Hitler could win more battles, but whether he had already lost the war before he even knew it. In the years before Barbarossa, Hitler's rise had seemed unstoppable. From 1939 to 1941, every gamble he took paid off. Spectacularly, Poland fell in weeks. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands followed. France, the most powerful army in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Across the world, newspapers printed the same phrase. The German war machine is unbeatable. Even Hitler began to believe it. He started to see himself not as a politician or even a general, but as a man chosen by fate. He told his aides that Providence guided every move he made. If a decision felt right to him, it must be right. If his intuition said attack, then victory was guaranteed. This faith in his own instincts became his most dangerous weapon and his most fatal flaw. Inside the Wehrmacht, professional officers whispered their unease. They had seen Hitler's luck before, but luck was not strategy. Men, like General Halder and Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, warned that Germany's victories had come against small nations or unprepared enemies. The Soviet Union, they said, was different, massive in size, rich in resources, and unbroken by invasion. For centuries. But Hitler dismissed them all. He called the Soviet army a rotten structure, its officers cowards, its people inferior. He believed one hard push, one blitzkrieg could topple the entire nation. His confidence was not just political. It had become spiritual, a kind of self-worship. Every success reinforced his belief that he could see what others could not, that the laws of war, logistics, and probability didn't apply to him. When generals questioned his plans, he waved them aside. When intelligence reports warned of Soviet strength, he called them lies. To him, doubt was treason and hesitation weakness. The more victories he achieved, the smaller his circle of advisers became. He surrounded himself not with experts, but with loyalists, men who agreed with every word. The system that once allowed the Wehrmacht to think critically, to plan carefully, was dissolving. By 1941, the German war effort was no longer guided by the cool logic of strategy. It was ruled by one, the man's conviction that his will could bend the world itself. The illusion of invincibility had taken hold, and it blinded him completely. He thought he was marching toward another victory, but in truth, he was marching toward disaster. When Hitler gave the order for Operation Barbarossa, Even his closest aides were stunned by its scale. It was the largest invasion in human history: 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and almost 4,000 aircraft stretched across an 1,800-mile front. He called it a lightning war, a quick campaign that would destroy the Soviet Union before the winter snows fell. "Kick in the door," he told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But behind the confidence, the gamble was enormous. Germany was already fighting Britain, struggling with a naval blockade that starved its factories of fuel and rubber. The Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority over Britain, and the U-boat war in the Atlantic was far from decisive. Now Hitler was opening another front, a front so vast that no European army had ever attempted anything like it. Still, the early weeks seemed to prove him right. German armoured divisions smashed through Soviet defences at Minsk, Smolensk and Kiev. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken. To many in Berlin, it looked like a repeat of the campaigns in the West. But the numbers hid a dangerous truth. For every Soviet division destroyed, 2 more appeared. The Red Army was battered but not broken. Its reserves seemed endless, and its factories far to the east beyond the Urals continued to produce tanks and guns. Meanwhile, the German supply lines stretched further. With every mile, trucks broke down, horses collapsed. In the mud, the railways built on a different gauge couldn't carry fuel fast enough. Soldiers went hungry, sleeping in fields, scavenging for food in villages that had nothing left to give. By late summer, commanders warned that the army was exhausted. The distances were too great. The equipment was wearing out, but Hitler refused to listen. Speed, he insisted, is everything. The enemy must not be allowed to recover. He pushed his armies deeper north toward Leningrad, south toward Ukraine, and east toward Moscow. The Wehrmacht was split into 3 separate forces, each operating hundreds of miles apart. Coordination collapsed. Communication lines faltered. It was no longer a lightning war. It was a slow grind through dust and heat against an enemy who refused to die. Even as reports of Soviet resistance grew, Hitler dismissed them as lies. He told Goebbels that the Soviet Union was finished, that he would be in Moscow by autumn. But the maps told a different story. German troops had advanced hundreds of miles, yes, but the Soviet Union was thousands more. Fuel shortages grew desperate, tanks sat idle. For the first time, officers began to realize that they might not reach their objective before winter, and winter in Russia was no ordinary winter. Still, Hitler pressed on. To him, the risk didn't matter. Logic didn't matter. He was gambling the future of his empire, and he believed luck would save him again. But the luck that had carried him through Europe was running out, and soon the very elements themselves would turn against him. By the autumn of 1941, German forces were within sight of their ultimate prize: Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, the heart of Stalin's power. Hitler was convinced that taking it would end the war in the East. He told his generals, "One more great victory and the enemy will collapse." But the men on the front lines saw a different reality. They had been marching for months without rest. Their boots were falling apart, their uniforms tattered, their supply trucks half empty. Fuel was scarce, and the roads had turned to rivers of mud, the dreaded Rasputitsa, the Russian autumn. Still, the order came: attack. As the mud froze into jagged ice, the German army launched its final push toward Moscow Operation Typhoon. Columns of tanks crept forward through snow and fog engines coughing in the cold. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. Thousands of Soviet prisoners were captured, towns were burned, and the Wehrmacht moved closer and closer to the city's outskirts. But then, the weather turned. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees, engines froze solid, rifle bolts locked up, fuel turned to jelly. Soldiers wrapped newspapers around their legs for warmth, their breath freezing in mid-air. The Wehrmacht had no winter clothing. Hitler had promised them victory before the first snow there had been no plan for. The cold. Then, on December 5th, the Soviets struck back. From the forests beyond Moscow, fresh divisions, many brought in from Siberia, surged forward under General Zhukov. They were equipped for winter, their white uniforms blending into the snow. T-34 tanks rolled through the blizzards as the Red Army counterattacked. The German front collapsed. Thousands of soldiers froze to death or were cut off in the snow. Entire units disappeared into the frozen landscape. For the first time since the war began, the German army was in full retreat, but Hitler would not allow the word retreat. From his headquarters, he raged at his generals, calling them cowards and defeatists. He forbade any withdrawal, ordering his men to stand fast where they are not one step back. In his mind, the enemy's advance could be stopped through sheer willpower. Told his staff, "If we do not move, the Soviets will break themselves against us." But the Soviet attack did not break. It grew stronger, and every day more German soldiers died in the snow, abandoned by the man who claimed to be their savior. By Christmas, the myth of invincibility was dead. The Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe in 2 years, was now trapped in a frozen nightmare it could not win. Hitler's generals begged him to fall back to regroup to save what was left. But he refused. He couldn't admit failure, couldn't face reality. The man who had once dazzled the world with his daring had become a prisoner of his own ego, and though the war would rage on for years, many within the German high command already knew the truth. The war had been lost in the snows outside Moscow. After the failure before Moscow, the world expected Hitler to adapt to learn from disaster. But instead, he changed in a different way. He grew harder, angrier, more isolated. In early 1942, the man who once listened to his generals began to shut them out completely. He blamed them for every setback, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. One by one, the men who had built the Wehrmacht's success, Halder Brauchitsch, Guderian, were dismissed or silenced. In their place came flatterers and ideologues, men who agreed with everything he said. The war that had once been guided by professional strategy became an extension of Hitler's personality, impulsive, emotional, and delusional. From his headquarters, the Sohn Wolf's Lair, he micromanaged every battle, every regiment, every move on the map. He would order attacks on towns he had never seen, arguing over minor roads while ignoring the broader collapse of the front, calling them lies from cowards. He no longer cared for logic, only loyalty. The generals who remained learned to speak carefully. To question Hitler's plans was to risk dismissal or worse. Meetings became rituals, not of planning, but of worship. Maps were spread out, markers placed, and Hitler would draw arrows with a shaking hand, claiming that destiny guided his pen. His war had become deeply personal. It was no longer about Germany's survival or even victory. It was about pride, about proving to the world that he could not be defeated. And with that pride came paranoia. He no longer trusted anyone, not the army, not his ministers, not even his oldest friends. He believed he alone understood the war's purpose. He ranted about traitors and conspiracies, seeing enemies everywhere except in himself. When the idea of peace was raised, he exploded with rage. He would rather see Germany destroyed, he said, than see it surrender. To him, defeat was unthinkable because defeat meant admitting he had been wrong. Inside, the Wehrmacht despair began to spread. Officers whispered in private that the Führer was losing touch with reality. Even loyal men like Field Marshal Manstein admitted that rational discussion was impossible. Every battle, every city, every hill was now fought to the last man. Hold your ground, Hitler demanded, or die on it. This order, repeated endlessly, turned victory into slaughter. Every inch of land became sacred, every retreat a crime. The war had ceased to be a campaign. It had become a crusade, one man's crusade against reason itself. As his obsession deepened, so did Germany's ruin. Because the moment Hitler stopped listening, the Reich stopped thinking. And when a nation stops thinking in the middle of a war, it's only a matter of time before it falls. By the summer of 1942, Hitler was desperate for another victory, something grand enough to erase the humiliation of Moscow. He believed one decisive blow could still destroy the Soviet Union, so he set his sights on the south, on the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that stood on the Volga River. Stalingrad. It was supposed to be a strategic move, cutting Soviet supply lines and seizing vital oil, but it quickly became something else entirely. To Hitler, the city's name alone, Stalingrad was an insult. He wanted it taken at any cost, not for strategy, but for pride. When his generals warned that the southern offensive was overstretched, he snapped. He split his forces in two, one toward the Caucasus, the other toward Stalingrad, ensuring that neither had enough strength. But he didn't care. He told them, the enemy must be annihilated. The Sixth Army under General Paulus marched into the city in late summer. At first they made progress, seizing districts, pushing the Soviets toward the river. German propaganda celebrated another coming triumph. But Stalingrad was no ordinary battlefield. It was a nightmare of ruins and rubble. Every street, every basement, every factory turned into a fortress. Soviet troops fought for every inch, snipers lurking in shadows, machine guns hidden in shattered windows. The city became a meat grinder. Day after day, the Sixth Army bled itself dry. Hitler, far away in his headquarters, demanded they push harder. He promised reinforcements, promised supplies that never came. And as autumn turned to winter, the Soviet trap began to close. In November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that encircled Stalingrad completely. Over 250,000 German troops were trapped. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground. The Sixth Army will be supplied by air, he declared. But the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver even a fraction of what was needed. The men in the ruins of Stalingrad starved and froze. Surviving on scraps of bread and horsemeat, they sent desperate radio messages. Ammunition gone, food gone, what shall we do? The answer from Hitler's headquarters was always the same. Fight to the last bullet. He refused every request to retreat or break out. He believed that if they held the city, the Soviets would collapse. But by January 1943, it was the Germans who were collapsing. Paulus, promoted to field marshal in a cruel gesture because no German field marshal had ever surrendered, finally laid down his arms on February 2nd. 91,000 men were taken prisoner. Only a few thousand would ever return home. When news of the defeat reached Berlin, there was silence. For the first time, even Hitler's closest followers understood. The Reich had suffered an irreversible blow. It was more than a lost battle. It was a broken myth. Hitler had promised his people victory or death. At Stalingrad he delivered both. And yet, even as the walls closed in, he refused to accept what everyone else already knew, that his obsession, his arrogance, had doomed his empire. But this was only the beginning of his downfall, because the same mistakes he made in Russia, he would soon repeat across the world. After Stalingrad, Germany still had powerful armies and skilled commanders. There was still time, perhaps not to win, but to survive. A leader willing to adapt might have negotiated, regrouped, or sought limited peace, but Hitler was not that man. To him, Stalingrad wasn't a failure of strategy. It was a failure of faith. He blamed his generals, his allies, even the weather, anything but himself. And so he doubled down. The same arrogance that had destroyed an army on the Volga now reached across continents. North Africa Field Marshal Rommel faced impossible odds. The British Eighth Army, armed and supplied by America's growing industrial power, was pushing west. Rommel begged for reinforcements, for permission to withdraw and regroup Hitler. Refused. Hold your position, he ordered, no step back. When the inevitable collapse came, the Afrika Korps was trapped and captured. Another army lost, another warning ignored. In Italy, it was the same story when the Allies invaded Sicily in 1943. Hitler could have pulled his forces north to defend the mainland. Instead, he insisted they fight to the last man. Entire divisions were wiped out in futile defences, buying time that achieved nothing. Even as Germany's situation worsened, Hitler's control tightened. He no longer saw his generals as commanders, he saw them as servants. He issued direct orders on how many tanks to move, where to turn, when to stop. Every delay was cowardice. Every suggestion was defeatism. By 1944, Germany's enemies had grown beyond imagining. From the west came Britain, Canada, and the United States. From the east, the Soviet Union, stronger than ever. The sky above Germany was black, with Allied bombers day and night, cities burned. Factories collapsed, civilians fled in endless columns, and yet Hitler still spoke of final victories. He told his people that new weapons would turn the tide. V1, rockets, jet aircraft, miracle tanks. He believed technology would do what strategy could not. Then came June 6th D-Day. The Allies landed in Normandy, storming the beaches under a wall of gunfire. It was the moment Hitler had always feared, the opening of a second front in Europe. But even here, his mistakes were fatal. When the invasion began, German commanders begged for permission to release the Panzer reserves. Hitler was asleep. No one dared wake him. Hours passed. By the time the order came, it was too late. The Allies had broken through and the beachheads were secure. After that, Germany's collapse accelerated, but Hitler still refused to retreat. He ordered counterattacks that had no chance of success, demanding sacrifices that achieved nothing. To him, every loss was proof that his generals lacked faith, not that his strategy lacked sense. The war had become a tragedy of repetition. Every failure led to more of the same: denial, blame, and blind obedience. And through it all, one truth became clear. Hitler could no longer see the difference between loyalty and suicide. He had turned the Reich into a mirror of his own mind, stubborn, desperate, and doomed. Yet even in the ruins of 1944, he still believed in one last miracle, one final gamble that would somehow undo everything that had gone wrong. And so as the Allies closed in, he prepared for his final offensive. By December of 1944, Germany was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins. Fuel was nearly gone, and the once proud Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. Millions of men were dead, or missing. But inside Hitler's bunker at the Wolf's Lair, reality no longer mattered. He still believed in miracles, and he was determined to create one. Hitler planned a bold counterattack in the west, one last strike to split the Allied armies, and capture the port of Antwerp. He called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. His generals warned it was madness. Germany had no reserves, no fuel, and no air support. But Hitler dismissed them. He said the Allies were soft and unprepared. Believed that one powerful blow could force them to negotiate peace. On December 16th, the German army struck through the Ardennes forest. Snow fell thick as panzers rolled through the mist, catching the Americans by surprise. For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible might happen again, like the old days of 1940. But this was not 1940. The German army no longer had the strength or the air superiority or the fuel. Within weeks, the offensive ground took a halt. Tanks sat, abandoned, empty, full of fuel. Men froze in their foxholes, outnumbered and outgunned. The miracle offensive became a disaster. By January, the Allies had crushed the Bulge. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were dead or captured. It was Germany's last gasp, and yet, even then, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He retreated into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The war above was lost, but down in the concrete tunnels, he continued to give orders to armies that no longer existed. He raged at phantom divisions, moved non-existent tanks across maps. He spoke of wonder weapons, jets, rockets, secret technologies that would reverse everything. Each passing day brought the Soviets closer, their artillery echoing, louder through the city streets. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler's circle had shrunk to a handful of loyalists, each trapped between fear and despair. The man who once commanded continents now lived in flickering lamplight surrounded by lies. As the Red Army entered Berlin in April 1945, he refused to leave. He believed that destiny, the same destiny that had once lifted him to power, would somehow save him again. Even as shells shattered the city above, he gave orders for counterattacks that would never come. But there were no armies left, no Luftwaffe, no reinforcements, no miracles. For a man who had believed he could bend the world to his will, the final truth was unbearable. And in those final dark days, surrounded by ruin, Hitler faced what he had spent his life denying: the limits of his own power. His empire, built on arrogance and illusion, crumbled around him. And as Berlin fell, so did the last remnants of the myth he had created. When the guns finally fell silent, In May of 1945, the world stood among ashes, cities were gone, tens of millions were dead, entire nations were scarred beyond recognition. And at the center of it all lay the legacy of one man's fatal overconfidence. Hitler's greatest mistake wasn't just a single decision, not Moscow, not Stalingrad, not the Ardennes. It was believing that destiny could replace logic, that ideology could replace reality, that the world would bend to his will simply because he demanded it. His invasions, his betrayals, his obsessions, each was born from the same root, the conviction that he was infallible, and that conviction destroyed him. The war he launched to build a 1,000-year empire lasted just 12 years. His Reich, which promised triumph and order, ended in ruin and chaos. The men who had once sworn loyalty to him were dead, captured, or disillusioned. The cities that had cheered his name were now smoking ruins. Even his miracle weapons, the rockets, the jets, the last-minute projects, couldn't save him. Technology without 2-3. Strategy meant nothing. Fanaticism without realism was suicide. In the end, the man who had demanded total obedience left behind only total destruction. And so Hitler's biggest mistake wasn't just tactical. It was human. He underestimated the strength of others and overestimated his own. History's verdict is clear. Hubris can win battles, but never wars. And for Hitler, that truth came too late.